Well, good morning, church. We're nearing the end of our exploration of this answer of Christian faith to the problem of suffering and evil in the world. We've seen that the question, if God is good, then why do terrible things happen? We've seen that's a legitimate question when asked honestly. But it's a complex question. It's based on a paradox and it has a complicated answer. And we like simple answers, slogans that we can remember easily, but that isn't what God has given us. So let's review all the parts of the answer we've already discovered and pull them together. And a reminder for you, to save time, I'm not mentioning all of the specific passages that offer scriptural support for various points. If you would like to see them, you can download the text from my sermon from the church website after it's posted there. So first, the foundation, which is that by His own sovereign plan, God created a real world in which cause and effect occur as one of the constants throughout the universe. And this universe that He made includes sentient, self-aware human beings and angels who possess genuine freedom, which is the ability to choose whether to act in accordance with God's will or to act contrary to God's will. And based on that foundation, we developed the following pieces for our answer. First of all, God made a real world, not a fantasy world. So some pain and suffering is due simply to the fact that the world is real. Secondly, the world is broken. All humans have sinned, brought corruption and pain and suffering into the world as a result. So some pain and some suffering, therefore, is due to the choices of sinful people and the subsequent corruption of human societies, in which sin has become endemic. Thirdly, there is an enemy. Satan leads a group of angels who rebelled against God. He formed a kingdom of darkness that is currently engaged in a war against God. Some pain and suffering, therefore, is due to the activity and the influence of Satan and his demons who seek to destroy that which God made and loves. Number 4, not everything that happens is the will of God. Because instead of determining everything that occurred in the universe, God determined to create a world in which humans and angels had the capacity to make freely chosen, self-determined decisions, and their choices, our choices, your choices, impact what occurs in the world. So much of the pain and suffering in the world does not reflect the will of God. It's not what He wanted or intended. Fifthly, there is a test coming. We saw that God brings judgment on people that can cause pain and suffering. You can't reason backward that because someone's suffering that it's because of judgment, but it is true that God does bring judgment. And He also allows pain and suffering, which He uses to test us or to discipline, to teach us. It brings about greater good for people and for families and nations and, in fact, for the whole human race as a result of that. And then last week we saw that heaven and hell are real, that this present world is insufficient for righting all wrongs, for punishing evil, for rewarding of good. That this age is only the preliminary stage that's designed for soul making, for preparing people for life in the next age. And in that next age, God's going to remediate the effects of evil and suffering, and He's going to reward or punish people and angels for their actions. But the promise of future relief or recompense, even though it's helpful, it still leaves us with some nagging questions. Why doesn't God do something about all of the present suffering, especially that which is due to the sins of others? We can understand suffering and pain that's simply a function of the nature of creation, or that God is using to test us or to discipline. But what about all the rest? And this question brings us to the most crucial portion of the answer, which is unique to Christian faith, bound up with the essential message of the gospel. Now, other religions might include some of the explanations that we've examined in the previous weeks of this series, and each of those preceding portions can be found in some form or other in other religions. But this seventh part of the answer, to my knowledge, has no parallel in any other religious or philosophical system, and I'm excluding offshoots and corruptions of Christian faith that still keep a little bit of this in there. The crucial element that is unique to Christian faith is this: God hurts too. God Himself suffers with and suffers for us. He has entered into our pain in order to heal us from our pain. Honesty, however, requires an admission, because the church has not always grasped this very well. We've always held it to be a foundational truth of Christian faith, but we haven't always thought through the implications of this truth very well. In the first few centuries of the church's existence, Greek philosophical ideas and categories dominated the thinking of the leaders of the church. And as a result, most Christian teachers held the view that since God was perfect, He could not suffer and He could not experience emotions. Their underlying assumption, which was based on Greek philosophy and the categories and ideas there, their assumption was that having emotions or suffering implied that the nature of God could change. But God, being perfect, was incapable of changing. And so for many centuries, this notion that God could not experience pain or suffering was held to be an essential aspect of the nature of God. And there are some who still hold to it today. It's known as being impassible, not having passions, not having emotions. The problem is that this idea that God was incapable of experiencing emotions or suffering conflicts with the biblical picture of God. And despite their good intentions, Christian theologians and church leaders who sought to explain Christian teaching through the lenses of Greek philosophy ended up distorting the picture and distorting the biblical message. And I'm glad that more and more of the leading thinkers in the church today are recognizing the need to hold fast to the biblical picture of God and to let go of these philosophical assumptions and categories that don't represent God rightly and thus don't help us understand who He is. Who is God? The Christian faith says He's the God who suffers. We start with the person of God. Christians understand that God is not an idea. God is not an inscrutable force. He's not another name for the cosmos. God is not a philosophical abstraction. He is not a necessary aspect of a system of beliefs. God is a divine person. And as a person, He has suffered Himself. The God of the Bible is not some distant deity incapable of feelings and impervious to pain. He is the creator of all, who is intimately and personally involved with every aspect of His creation. He is responsive to us. He interacts with individuals within history. He enters into relationships with people. He knows the pain of suffering and loss. And God's knowledge of suffering and pain is not simply a function of His infinite knowledge and His wisdom, because He knows everything. His knowledge is not limited to the intellectual comprehension of the concepts of suffering and the concepts of pain. As a divine person, God has personally experienced pain and emotional suffering. This understanding of God as a person capable of actually experiencing and feeling pain is evident throughout the Old Testament. We see in the Old Testament a number of ways in which God experienced emotional pain, particularly due to Israel's rejection of His love and rejection of the covenant. And the intensity of God's emotional pain is especially evident in those places where God speaks of being provoked to wrath by the idolatry of His people. For instance, this passage from Deuteronomy chapter 9, verses 6 to 8. Moses tells the people, the children of Israel, "Know this, know then, it is not because of your righteousness that the Lord your God is giving you this good land to possess, for you are a stubborn people. Remember, do not forget how you provoked the Lord your God to wrath in the wilderness. Excuse me. From the day that you left the land of Egypt until you arrived at this place, you have been rebellious against the Lord, and even at Horeb you provoked the Lord to wrath. And the Lord was so angry with you that He would have destroyed you." What He doesn't say is, "But I interceded for you." There are other significant moments that similarly point out God's emotional responses to Israel's unbelief. 1 Samuel chapter 8 records God's disappointment that Israel had rejected Him as king over them in order to have a human king. The prophet Hosea conveys God's deep affection for his people, as well as God's deep anguish. He pictures God as experiencing gut-wrenching emotional distress. God says, my insides are turned upside down over having to bring judgment upon Israel. We read of God's regret and grief. He laments his decision to create people who have filled the earth with violence prior to the flood. He tells Samuel, I regret making Saul king. His deep sorrow over what has happened. But someone might say, well, you're not understanding. Those expressions are really just metaphors. They don't mean that God has actual emotions any more than the expression the hand of God means that God has physical hands. It's a fair point. However, even if these passages are examples of metaphorical language, the metaphorical significance must mean something. There must be something in God which corresponds to the feature of human emotions which is being used as a point of comparison. Now we understand the part about the physical metaphors that have reference to physical things because we understand God's a spirit. Expressions that refer to physical body parts must clearly be metaphorical and not have some physical component to which they are representative. God does not have a physical body to which his spirit is bound. But these expressions about his emotions depict emotional states. They are expressions that are not incompatible with spiritual existence. And they correspond to analogous capacities in both divine and human persons. Well, God's experience of suffering in his relationship with Israel is not the only thing we find in the Bible. Most importantly, we see that God has also experienced suffering firsthand through the life and death of Jesus. Because as Paul tells us in Colossians, God was fully present in the person of Jesus, the Son of God. Christian faith has always understood that Jesus was fully divine and simultaneously fully human, even though we can't adequately explain how that can be the case. We hold as a fundamental article of faith the mystery of the incarnation, that God became human through being miraculously conceived in the womb of Mary, then born in the ordinary way, growing up as her son, the man Jesus of Nazareth. The doctrine of the incarnation, that God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself, that means that during Jesus' earthly life, in the person of Jesus, God experienced firsthand every kind of suffering that ordinary people experience. Consider for a moment just a few facts about the life of Jesus. Let's look at his life experience. Excuse me. To begin with, he grew up in poverty. He suffered the pain of deprivation. We know that Jesus' parents were poor from the fact that they brought the minimum offering for his dedication, the minimum offering that the law allowed for. Jesus knew what it was like to not have enough. He knew what it was like to go hungry, to be cold, to be in need. And he lived, secondly, under the oppressive rule of a foreign power that occupied his land, that subjected the people to cruel punishment, to burdensome taxation, and a continual humiliation. The Roman legions occupying Galilee probably didn't spend that much time, if any at all, in Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. But their presence could be felt in the region. It affected everyone. And as an adult, Jesus would have encountered the Romans quite frequently, especially in nearby Sepphoris and in Capernaum. He would have been very familiar with being despised by the Romans, verbally mocked and ridiculed for his Jewish faith. He was subject to the overt racism and the elitism that came from working in a city built by Jewish labor for the benefit of the Romans and other Gentiles, as well as for the wealthy Jews who curried favor with their overlords. And for that matter, Galilee, the region where he grew up, was a hotbed of revolutionary fever. And there were many Galileans who wanted to overthrow the Romans, and as a result, many who were captured and punished for trying to do so. Jesus had seen many a cross in his lifetime. He knew what it signified, and he felt the pain of empathy for those who were crucified, his brethren. Thirdly, he worked as a builder. Jesus was a builder, a mason who worked with stone and wood. And like many men in Galilee, he was a day laborer who sought work wherever he could find it. And the most likely place for him to find work would have been in the nearby city of Sepphoris, which was a Roman city about an hour's walk from Nazareth. Sepphoris was undergoing an extensive boom in public building projects during Jesus' lifetime, and that's where you could find work. In the course of doing his normal job, he would have experienced minor cuts and bruises. He would have experienced physical exertion and exhaustion, all of the normal kinds of pain that come from working in the building trades. And then there were the encounters with people of all sorts. Encounters with other laborers, bosses, onlookers, shopkeepers, soldiers, tax collectors, slaves, beggars, rulers. He would have had interactions with all of those sorts of people. And he would have experienced all of the ordinary stresses and problems that come with personal interactions, with social relations, and with business and work engagements. Fourthly, he endured all of the normal painful experiences of life. He grew up in a large family that lived in small quarters. He grew up in a small village where everybody knows everybody's business. He experienced the tedium of a daily commute, walking to and from Sepphoris every day to work. He grew up dealing with limited resources, all of the normal stuff that brings pain in our lives. He suffered the grief of the death of at least one family member, his earthly father Joseph. After the mention of Jesus' trip to the temple when he was 12 years old in Luke chapter 2, whenever the Gospels refer to Jesus' family, and they do several times, they never mention Joseph, only Jesus' mother and his siblings. Presumably, we're meant to understand that Joseph died at some point prior to Jesus' entrance into ministry. And as the oldest son, Jesus would then have had to assume the responsibility of providing for the family, with all of the problems and the burdens that come with that role. When Isaiah prophesied that the Messiah would be acquainted with grief, Isaiah 53, verse 3, he's not saying solely that this has reference to his death on the cross. It includes his entire lifetime of experiences of grieving. And next, Jesus also knew the unusual sufferings and the painful experiences that came with his messianic task. He lived with the constant rumors of a questionable birth and suggestions that he was illegitimate. And when the Jews in Jerusalem demanded that Jesus identify his father in John chapter 8, they're probably making a very pointed challenge to his ancestry, calling into question his birth, and indicating that there were rumors or doubts about his birth. We have later Jewish sources from the late 1st century and early 2nd century that include various very scurrilous accusations that Jesus was the illegitimate offspring born from an illicit affair between Mary and a Roman soldier named Panthera, which is a Greek word that is a pun on the Greek word for a virgin, Parthenos. And these later rumors arose as counter-propaganda against Christian preaching of the virgin birth. Not only that, but Jesus was deemed insane, both by his enemies and by his family. He was accused of being a sorcerer, accused of being demon-possessed by religious leaders who were frightened by his displays of power over demonic spirits. He was rejected by the people he came to save. He was despised by those whose hearts were hardened by their spiritual blindness and pride. He had followers who quit following, who were glad when they thought he would use his power to defeat the Romans, but who were incensed at him when he insisted that they must love their enemies. He was betrayed by a close friend, and he was abandoned by his closest disciples in his hour of greatest need. Let me point out two more significant examples from the life of Jesus, two episodes from the Gospels that show God's emotional response to us in our pain. The first is when Jesus wept over the city of Jerusalem. You can read about that in Luke chapter 19. Not only was he saddened by their unbelief and for their failure to recognize what God had offered to them, he was grieving for the suffering and the pain which they would undergo. the awful consequences that would come upon them as a result of their unbelief. He grieved for what he knew was going to happen, that in only a few short decades, the Roman legions were going to surround this city and besiege it with the devastating cruelty that meant horrific suffering for people that he loved. And second, about the same time, in John 11:35, we see Jesus who has come to the tomb of his friend Lazarus. And John 11:35 is a verse that's famous for being the shortest verse in the Bible, in the King James. It says quite simply, Jesus wept. It ought to be famous for what it shows us about God. This powerful declaration that Jesus wept has often been misinterpreted. It's been preached in a way that dismisses Jesus' emotional pain and his empathy with Lazarus' family and with Lazarus' friends who were grieving there at the graveside. I've heard preachers say that Jesus was simply weeping over the unbelief of those gathered there since he knew that he was going to raise Lazarus from the grave. I'm sorry, but those preachers missed the mark entirely. They missed the point of the narrative. The narrative of John 11 stresses Jesus' love for Lazarus. And it notes that when Jesus raised from the dead, he was acting out of deep compassion and empathy with those who were grieving. Certainly, Jesus was affected by the unbelief of those around him, but this passage emphasizes Jesus' identification with the sorrows and the griefs of people whom he loved. He wept because the sufferings of people touched his emotions and his heart. He wept because he felt their pain and he hurt with them. Because in Lazarus' death, all of the pain and all of the suffering and all of the death of human history was crystallized, represented there, and Jesus wept for all of it. I remember hearing a powerful testimony about this verse. Excuse me. There was an Asian man who had never heard of Jesus Christ. He'd grown up as a Buddhist. He did not know the gospel of the teachings of Christ. He was given a Bible by a Christian. And when he read this passage, John 11, and he came to the words that Jesus wept, he came back to the man who had given him the Bible and told him that he wanted to become a Christian. And when he was asked why he wanted to convert, his reply was this: "We do not have a God like this. We do not have a God who weeps for us." He understood what so many have not. And when Jesus wept for Lazarus, God was weeping for us. Here's another bit of evidence to show us God's experience of sharing in our suffering. When Jesus told his disciples that he and the Father were one, he wanted them to understand that because the Father was in him, his life revealed the Father to them. And he also let them know, he said, "I am in the Father and the Father is in me." Meaning that in the Trinity, Father and Son were so united, they were inseparable one from the other. They were not identical. Who they were did not merge into something else. Jesus was the Son and the Father was the Father. But each one, inseparably united, experienced what the other experienced. And that means that all that Jesus experienced was also experienced or felt somehow by the Father and by the Spirit. So the Father did not suffer death on the cross. But somehow, God the Father experienced and shared in that experience the pain of rejection, of mocking, of beating, of scourging, of crucifixion and death that the Son experienced. The Father, and not just the Son, felt the pain of Jesus' death. In fact, he experienced a pain that's greater than, but very much like, that felt by every human parent who has ever lost a child. Because God knows exactly what it feels like to watch your beloved son die. God's suffering, in fact, has exceeded that of any human person. Indeed, God's suffering has exceeded that suffering of all humanity combined, because only God has borne in his own person the punishment for the sins of all people. No one else has faced the full force of Satan's temptation but Jesus. Every other one of us has yielded to Satan's temptation. We have all given way to weaker attacks. He hasn't had to use his full arsenal of weapons against us because we've all given way to lesser temptations. Only Jesus has endured every possible temptation we have seen and more, including the temptation to come down from the cross and save himself, something that Jesus had within his power to do. But he refused to save himself in order to save us. No one else has become a sin offering despite having known no sin. When Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:21 that God made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, he's not referring to some mysterious action in which the Son of God is somehow transformed into sin itself. No, it means that Jesus became a sin offering for all people through his death. He took on all of the sins of the world upon himself so that he became identified with all sin. No one else was perfectly innocent and yet suffered as if he was guilty of all sins of all mankind for all time. Only Jesus has suffered in that way, and only God knows what that feels like. Now, God's suffering is not offered to us so that we might sympathize with him, but so that we can know that he sympathizes with us. And that's the importance of the passage that we read this morning from Hebrews. God is neither immune to pain, nor removed from our suffering, nor indifferent to our pain. Because he has suffered as we have, he's able to sympathize with us. And not only is he sympathetic to our pain, he is willing to help. Just as human parents feel the anguish and pain when their children suffer. If you're a parent, you've felt that. When your kids are going through it and you can't do anything to help them. You felt that pain. So too it is with God. He hurts with what hurts us. He feels our pain. What hurts us hurts him as well. God suffered so that he could take up our suffering into himself, and thereby making it possible for us to be ultimately freed from our pain. The Christian gospel presents God as the one who has entered into time and space, who has lived as a man, suffered both in life and in death, so he is fully cognizant of suffering from his own experience of suffering. He is the God who has suffered with us. So the Christian answer to the question, well, why doesn't God do something, is this: God has already done something. He has done what no one else could do. In order to eliminate suffering, he has absorbed in himself the consequences of the just judgment upon sinners for their sins. And that is the unique part of the answer to the problem of suffering that Christian faith provides. And knowing this, knowing that God weeps for us, that he has suffered for us, gives us a way to see suffering differently. It allows us to embrace suffering, to allow it to be a means for the Spirit of God to transform us into his image. We know that he has suffered for us. And those of you who have been here for a while, I invite you to revisit the journey through 1 Peter that we took last year and emphasize this point. When we know that God has suffered for us, we can see that God's use of suffering in our lives is not vindictive, it's not mechanistic, it's not sadistic. He suffers with us and offers us both his sympathy and his help. He enters into our pain and takes it on himself so that we can be free. And because God has suffered with us and suffered for us, it's easier to trust him with my pain, to yield to the working of his Spirit in my pain. So here's what we need to remember. This is the crucial part of the answer that reflects the uniquely Christian perspective to suffering that comes from what we see in God, his death in Christ on the cross. Number one, God himself has suffered. He understands what it is to hurt because he has endured even greater pain than any of us has experienced. Let me just make a side note there. All of us when we're in pain, think that our pain is the worst. God has experienced greater pain than you have experienced, than you're going through right now or that you've ever gone through. Secondly, God himself has borne in himself the suffering of the world, has entered into our suffering in order to free us from our pain, not just so we go, oh, wow, that was great. And thirdly, I am not alone in my pain. God understands my pain. He invites me to allow him to absorb my pain in order to relieve me of the pain. Now, there's one more very important part of the answer, so be sure to come back next week to hear that.